I think, firstly, the idea that Putin is feeling hugely victorious in his war in Ukraine is overblown. Yes, his forces have been on the front foot in a number of areas in the battlefield recently, but remember, Putin thought he could conquer the country in 3 days. This has been an economically devastating conflict for Russia and one devastating for its own population with the amount of casualties that he's incurred. Of course, there's little opportunity to democratically challenge that in that country. Now, yes, the Europeans have real questions over the Trump administration's commitment. They did agree to increase their own defense spending significantly earlier this year. A lot of Trump's rhetoric is just a negotiation tactic, so I think they're wary that they don't want to anger him too much. These questions certainly are in flux and being dealt with differently than before.
Mr. Hess, I want you to now put yourself in the position of how probably a Russian strategist would think about this. Russia, in the aftermath of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, wanted closer relations with the West. And the Russians would, of course, turn around and say that, listen, at a point of time, we even wanted to be part of the NATO military alliance, something that Vladimir Putin had suggested, around about the year 2000. But that did not happen. The Russians would say that the West does not look at the security concerns of Russia seriously enough. The NATO frontier has been expanding ever closer to Russia, and therefore there is a fundamental shift that is happening. Russia is now looking for allies in the East, and the pendulum could be turning where Russia would be engaging more closely with Beijing and India, even if this is not going to be a partnership that is a natural one. How do you assess the Russian position here, where it wants a closer relationship with New Delhi and with Beijing?
I think it's very important to Russia that it looks to try to advance a so-called multipolar world. It is afraid of a world in which the U.S. is dominant, and it is also afraid of a world in which the Chinese are too dominant. Russia wants a world in which there are many smaller powers so that it too can be one of the players on the block. The idea that Russia will be a true great power on the level of China or the United States, or arguably even India, is at this stage largely a fantasy due to the mismanagement of that country itself. Now, they do certainly have their own security concerns. How those have been voiced around NATO has been very different. This is really an imperial project for Putin. Remember, he makes almost no objection to the NATO membership for Sweden and Finland that joined since 2022. But this is a country dominated by one man and his whims, and tragically what he says goes, and hundreds of thousands have to die, and economic devastation is wrought all over the place as a result of that. There are, however, some opportunities, and that is where India has looked to take advantage by getting cheap oil. Is there really a basis for expanding that relationship, though, in a way that is mutually beneficial or more beneficial to India than Russia? I think highly unlikely.
It's interesting that you still insist that this is a war of imperialism for the Russians, and the fact that the NATO frontiers have been expanding ever closer to Russia is something that you say is secondary. Sweden and the other nation got into the NATO military alliance because of the realities of the Ukraine war. But I want you to now for a minute think about the changing scenario from the Indian perspective. Do you think India, that has been trying to keep itself equidistant from all power centers of the world, where India says that it does not want to be aligned with any one big power, it will do business with anyone with whom India's interests are served. Do you think the American approach towards India has been counterproductive, which is what has damaged the relationship that India had with Washington for the last 3 odd decades, and has now brought India closer in a way that no one would have expected with Moscow and perhaps even with Beijing?
I think without a doubt that the American approach under the Trump administration with regards to India has been hugely counterproductive. But to look at this from an Indian perspective, for India, there are very strong reasons not to support Putin's war of aggression, because just look what happens in India's own neighborhood, and with Pakistan, its neighbor, launching aggression to try to unilaterally change borders there. So that is not a precedent that India wants to set. Moscow proves itself to be an unreliable defense partner, delaying delivery of key equipment at this time while it's focused on its own war at home. And remember, who was standing alongside Vladimir Putin when he launched this conflict, and who Putin was shifting moving his alliance towards, none other than former Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan. Putin is a master of trying to get what he can from any number of countries, but he is not a reliable ally.
All right. Now, the India-Pakistan conflict that happened as a case of Operation Sindoor happened because of a terror attack that was sponsored by Pakistan in Pahalgam in the month of April. So India's response was Operation Sindoor. And although Pakistan is a small player here, in a talk when we're talking about India, Russia, the United States of America, Pakistan is more a nuisance than an actual player in this scenario. But the question is this, when you look at how things are changing, the fact that India and China, which had issues in the aftermath of the Galwan conflict, Russia and China, who obviously look at each other with a certain level of suspicion. Now, these three nations have been pushed to find common ground because of Donald Trump's attitude of trying to bully other nations into submission, which simply is not going to happen. Do you think this is a fundamental shift that we're looking at in the global order? Because some people are even calling this the post-Western global order, where probably the G7 may not remain as relevant as it did in the end of the 20th century, because the next century would be driven by nations such as China, India, Russia, and amongst other powers that are newly emerging.
I certainly think the next century will be more driven by China and India than the last century was. I think that the idea that the next century will be more driven by Russia, which in the previous century was a superpower in the Soviet Union, is farcical. Russia, in the long run of history, is a relative loser in these matters and will continue to be so. And I think that is likely to be Vladimir Putin's ultimate legacy, even if he is able to temporarily occupy some additional Ukrainian territory as the result of a settlement in this war. I certainly think, as we've said earlier, that the Trump administration's approach has been counterproductive here. But look, Russia has offered temporary friendships and alliances of convenience to India in the past, including in its Soviet guise. That caused a number of trade issues after the Soviet Union collapsed. There's not really much Russia can offer other than petrol to India at this stage.
All right, we'll dwell on that a little bit more. Do continue to stay on with this. Meanwhile, we're getting these very first images that have been posted of the Indian Prime Minister and the Russian President Vladimir Putin from inside the car in which the Indian Prime Minister, of course, received the Russian President. Remember, this is a high-stakes meeting. There's a lot of symbolism that is attached to these images that are now coming out from New Delhi. This is also that very interesting moment where there are new alliances that will be forged. Earlier partnerships will be strengthened and more common ground would be sought to be made because of the changing geopolitics and as to how things could dramatically turn. And we have with us Mr. Maximilian Hess, who is joining us live from London. Mr. Hess, it's interesting that you say that Russia has been opportunistic in what it offers to India. In fact, a lot of people will turn around and say that Russia has been this long, stable partner who's always been happy to share technology, especially military technology, with India. And the reason why, despite the fact that some thought that India leans more closely towards the Soviet Union, Russia has proven itself to be a much more reliable partner than the United States of America. How do you respond to that? The United States, because of the attitude that it has had in the past of trying to get India to sit in its camp, of not willing to transfer technology for the weapons that it sells, has not really tried to earn any favors from India. And therefore, Russia's partnership looks like the better one if one has to choose between the two. What's your assessment of that?
I think that inflates Russia's global position quite significantly. And that doesn't mean that the U.S. has been a reliable partner or that the Trump administration has handled these things in good manners. But the Russian economy is smaller than the economy of the state of New York, the state of Texas, the state of California, all places that are governed by governors who are much more favorable to relations with India and who have been critical of the Trump administration's approach. The current tariff threats, I believe, are temporary and part of a negotiating strategy with Russia. And it would be unwise to reject all of the much larger opportunity that the West still offers, including Europe, where, remember, even the Italian economy is larger than the Russian economy, in favor of overdependence on Moscow.
interesting that you stick with the assessment there. But of course, one can agree to disagree on a lot of these issues. Yes, the governors of New York and some of the other states that you mentioned within the United States of America, which have a bigger economy than Russia, could be more predisposed towards having good relations with India. But the person in charge in the United States at the moment is Donald Trump, and he is the one who's calling the shots there. But we'll have to leave it there. We're completely out of time. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Maximilian Hess, for joining us with that perspective from London there. For all the latest news, download the WION app and subscribe to our YouTube channel.